order to understand the basis of Scripture, we must place ourselves in the context from which they were written. As the Scriptures confirm, there is power of life and death in the tongue, and in order for us to understand the words spoken, we must acquire a superior knowledge which comes from the Creator, Most High, the Beneficent, the Most Merciful. This podcast is dedicated to the seeking of knowledge, the reading of written word, and the understanding of the will of the Most High Creator of the ends of the universe. May He forgive me if I do or say anything wrong.
Yo, peace family. Welcome back to session 2. I know this has been long awaited from session 1, but we're going to dive in a little bit deeper in session 2, talking about what's lost in translations. If you haven't already checked out the first session was it was very revealing. It dived deeply into 4 common types of translations. What are translations in the first place? And more importantly, what should we understand about translations? What is it that we need to understand in order for us to be able to get what the writer was trying to get us to get from anything that we're reading? And so this session is session 2, part 2 of that particular session. It talks about being lost in translations. And this is a deep dive into, a commonly used word here in the Western society that we use it typically in one context. However, when we see it show up in scriptures, in most contexts, it's showing up in a different form. And if we're not careful, we will apply the common use to every single context of the use of this particular word. And so I'm excited to dive into this session, because this session we're going to talk a little bit deeper into just understanding translations. Now, before we do that, though, I did want to give a quick rundown just to remind you a little bit of what we covered last time. We covered the 4 different types of translations. Now, for those that are in the chat, feel free. I'll give a pause real quick to allow for a few moments to actually look into the notes that you may have taken from the last session, or to just recall some of the things that you took away from that very first session. But there are 4 different types of translations that we talked about in the last session. So let's see if we can get someone to recall those before I actually reveal what those are. And then more importantly, what are the different types of functions that we talk about when we talk about those translations. So let's see what we have. See if anybody can dive into those. And while we do that, I'll transition us into the message for what we're going to talk about today. I hope everyone's day was great. She's been having an amazing week so far. And I don't see that anyone has posted it yet. So I want to talk about those 4 different types of translations really quick. So the first one that we talked about last session, so session 1. And again, it's available for replay. So if all you have to do is just go back and look at the previous live videos. You'll see it available in the replays. And there's a link also in the description of this particular video. So you can click on the link that's directly in the video. That'll link you out directly to it. But the first type of translation that we talked about a literal translation. And this is where the scholar who actually did the translating, or scholars with an S, were intending to get what we call a word for word type of translation. We gave the example last time from Spanish, tengo hambre. And again, we talked about the literal. If you take that in a literal standpoint, it would be I have hunger. Well, conversationally, that doesn't make a lot of sense, right? So, when we think about, from a conversation standpoint, that probably would make a whole lot of sense to you from a conversation standpoint. So that was the first. The first was a literal translation where we're talking about that word for word. We're trying to match up a word in the original language to a word that's in the translated language. We also talked about the fact that, with any translation that you pick up, no matter what translation it happens to be, there's always going to be something that's lost or gained. We talked about the fact that there's not always an equivalent in the language in which we're trying to translate into, and for that reason, you're going to end up with something either lost or gained, and that's largely on the part of those that are doing the translation or the interpreting of the translation when you get those things. Okay, so that's the first one. First one was a literal. The second one was what we call a dynamic equivalent. Okay, now this is where we're trying to get a thought for thought, so a little bit longer, right? Word for word, you're trying to get each word to match up, right? A thought that's typically expressed in what we call a sentence, right? For those that have been to English class or remember anything from English class, your thoughts are expressed through sentences, right? And so when we talk about thought for thought, the translator was taking, a comparative sentence in the original language, right? Which according to, what we know about the scriptures were originally in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek for the New Testament. So Hebrew and Aramaic, Old Testament, and then of course the Greek for the New Testament. And so this is where they take a sentence, right? They're taking the full sentence and they're trying to understand the thought that was attempted to be conveyed from that particular sentence, and they are then attempting to put that into the new translated language. Okay. We also talked about a little bit of the history last week, or last session rather, about different biblical translations, right? The fact that the original translations that were translated into the language that I speak and that a lot of the world speaks, which is English, that those translations were originally from Latin. Well, okay, you got to deal with the additional complexity there, because if we know that the original scriptures were in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, then we know that to translate that into Latin and then to go into English, there's an additional conversion that needs to take place, right? So just think about the involvement that a human being or someone that's interpreting that language has to go through to translate from the original Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek into Latin and then into English, right? And then lo and behold, along comes William Tinsdale. And William Tinsdale actually goes back to the original scriptures, and that's where he grabs a lot of his translations from, were from the original scriptures. So he went back to the original Hebrew and Aramaic and the Greek. Was the first full translation, right? Remember, we also talked about the fact in the last session that the translation started off in partials. That you got Old Testament version of the translations before you got the New Testament version of the translations. And then they coupled the two, and then all of a sudden, you get the William Tinsdale, which actually goes back to the original. So I say all that to say that the Tinsdale version of the scripture that was used was the first and complete version of a translation that was closer to any other translations, due to the fact that he went back to the original languages as opposed to using an additional translation by going from the Latin. So, okay, good. That's the second one, a dynamic equivalent. Dynamic equivalent is attempting to get the thought for thought, right? So, especially if you think about, and we gave examples to this last week as well. So, when we think about a word for word translation, you're thinking about your King James version of the Bible, right? You're thinking about a, New American Standard version of the Bible, right? Those are the ones that are attempting to do that word for word translation, right? But when you talk about a dynamic equivalent, we're talking about the NIV, right? The New International Version. That's one. The CSB, which is the Christian Standard Bible, which that just so happens to be the version of the Bible that I'm going through my plan with right now. I discussed that last session with you guys. If you want to join me on this journey, it's a chronological 365-day plan that I've done, multiple times with multiple different translations. Now I'm at about 12 different translations now that I've went through chronologically, and I don't usually spend the whole 165 days or 365 days or a year, going through translation. I typically finish them quicker than that 365 days. But I encourage you to go at the pace that's most comfortable for you. But I say that to say, if you're going to pick up a translation and use a translation, especially for someone that's starting off as your first time reading, it may behoove you to look into a dynamic equivalent as opposed to a formal translation, due to the fact that it's probably going to be closer to getting you a thought for thought type of translation. It's going to be closer to getting you towards what the reader was wanting you to get from the writing. Okay. All right, so let's talk about the third. So that's the first two, right? We've got the literal and the dynamic equivalent. So we've talked about those first two, okay? So now let's talk about what we call a functional. Now this is another one. I would recommend this as well, especially for someone that's, you may have not even had any teachings whatsoever. You've never been to what we call a quote unquote church. Or a physical building and receiving the teachings, or you may have not even watched, videos online, right? A lot of people in these days and times, they consume content online, and that's how they get the word or the scripture from their standpoint. So you may not have been, introduced to that, but you're curious, right? You want to start the process of being able to know. This would be the one that I would recommend to you, would be what we call a functional. And this is all about meaning based. This is trying to get you towards the meaning. What are things meaning in that original language that they're now translated into. So this is what we call our New Living Translations, right? Though that's an example of that. The Good News Translation is another example of what we would call a functional. And again, their goal is to get you closer towards the meaning. Now, again, we're not talking about the cons, and we're talking about the pros for each of these, but we're not necessarily talking about the cons. And here's what I would say to you: it's a generalization. The closer you get removed from the original language, in other words, when you think about the dynamic equivalent, right? That's talking about a thought for thought, right? Or sentence for sentence type of translation, right? The more you widen that scope, the more interpretation is introduced into the translation, which means that it's up to the person that's doing the interpreting to determine how they're going to interpret certain things. So that means you're getting more of an interpreter's view as opposed to a writer's view, the one that was writing the text. So I say that to say that if you're just starting off, please, by all means, functional or dynamic equivalent, start there. Those are going to be the ones that you'd want to start with. That'll help you to get closer towards the meaning, closer towards the actual thoughts that the writer was trying to get you to understand. Okay, which is going to get you closer to the lessons that you need to extract. And as I talked about in the last session, right? Please lean not on my understanding or your own understanding, but seek the understanding and the wisdom that comes from the Creator, the divine. Because all of this is inspired by the events that took place for the people that are known as His people, and those that are not necessarily His people. We talked a little bit about that too last week. There are people who have a nefarious objective when it comes to your understanding or lack thereof of the text. Again, based on a lot of mechanisms that are in place today, the control mechanism is set an all-time high, and so a lot of people use it for their own personal preferences. We even talked about the history of the King James in previous sessions. So like I said, this is a shameless plug. The link is in the bio, in the description of this particular video for the session 1. And there are some gems and some jewels that are dropped in session 1. But I just wanted to give a quick overview of that. And then the final, which I've also went through in this particular version as well, which is what we call the interpretive or the paraphrase or the expansive version. So this is like the Message, the amplified version. So you'll find a lot of people use the amplified version. So I'll stay with that really quick. We just talked about the amplified version. In the amplified version, you'll find a lot of things in parentheses. A lot of that is added emphasis. It's the expansion. They're giving you some expansion on what's there. Now, while these they may be poetic in their reading, especially the message it adds a lot of additional words to the scripture and the text, but it's more about the feeling, the vibes that you're getting from the message. It's more romantic or poetic in its reading, and it does help you to get a 30,000 foot view of the context of the scripture, especially for someone that is it's almost like a baby can pick it up and read it. Someone that's first starting to learn to read. This may be the type of version that would appeal to you. Um, but these are far removed from getting you towards what the writer was intending for you to take away from the session. So just keep that in mind, right? So we talked about this all in the previous session. I just wanted to give a quick recap before we dive into today's session and we talk about an example of words. We know that according to, was it John 1 and 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And the fact that we're reading from a book that was written, centuries ago, right? Um, Years upon years upon years, the original manuscripts and the original text, right, found in the caves over in Qumran and different areas and various areas over in the Middle East and over in the northern parts of Africa, right? Um, we're reading of ancient stories, ancient texts that were written many, many years ago, right? But just because we're reading that text doesn't mean that the creator stopped writing. So just to put that into context, our daily lives is the scripture also says that we're epistles read of men. Well, what is that? What is an epistle? Epistle is a book. We're book read of men. In other words, God is continuing to write on the chapters of our lives. No matter what we're going through or what we're experiencing right now, He's continuing His writing as He's writing about your life. And some faiths, some religions even believe that in the end, we'll all open a book. And in that book, it will be a book of your deeds, of your entire life, where it will not add anything to or remove anything from everything that's taken place over your lifetime, right? And that depending on, how well we did with this precious opportunity that we have to live life, uh, that will determine, what your what the afterlife is for that particular faith, right? And so I say that to say that, take what's there in the text and the lessons and the messages that are there and apply them daily. The scripture says, renew your mind, constant renewal of your mind daily. When? Daily, yes. And that is what the whole premise of why I'm doing this 3-part series is that you would understand or have at least a better understanding of what's there in the old ancient text, and that you would bring it forward to apply it. The Swahili term, I think, is called Sankofa. That you would grab the lessons that are there in the past and bring them forward and apply them to the generations now. And so that is what the purpose of these particular sessions happens to be, is that you would be able to apply it forward, bring it forward. Each one teach one, per se. It says, scripture says to train up a child in the ways in which he should go and he will never depart from them. And so hopefully this will help you to gain a better understanding, to gain clarity from something that has, for a long period of time been a mystery to many people, or that was even sacred, held only in priesthood, that only the priest could pick up the scriptures and interpret those for you and then disseminate those down to you. But like I said, along the way, men found how powerful the scriptures were in being able to affect change or to an influence over people, and they started to apply that in mass to groups, to their own agendas, their own goals. So my goal is simply that you would know the truth, you would understand the truth, and that it would bring you closer to what your creator and my creator is trying to get you to understand about this thing called life and how you can leave it at peace with one another. So That said, let's dive in. Let's dive into this next session. So we've got this next session here. It's called session number 2, which is about lost in translations. Now, this is a deep dive into some of the words that we use wrong in a Western context, and I would even say globally, because the language of English is now become a global language, and so it's used widely across the world in a different context. So, without further ado, let's dive into this next piece is group activity. Understanding this particular word. This word is called adultery. That every one of us has heard this term before. It's been used widely, especially for those that are entered into what we call a so-called marriage, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But we're going to dive deep. We're going to dive into definitions, etymology. Now, for those that understand the term etymology, so etymology is, the origins, where you get a thing from, where you derive a thing from. And so we'll dive deep into the etymology as well, discuss where did this word come from, because without understanding the where it came from, it's going to be hard for us to be able to apply it to the context in which we're going to read it in scriptures a little bit later on. So we'll talk about the first use of it. We'll dive into, some continual uses as we go throughout the scripture, and then we'll arrive at a place where in Isaiah it talks a little bit about it as well. So, and even give you some not just the Old Testament. We'll also dive into some of the New Testament context of this word as well. All right, so let's dive a little bit deeper. All right, let's go. So, okay, when we talk about a definition, right? I've given a couple here. There's a couple, and I even give an example there in the middle, but there's a couple different definitions. I got one from Oxford, and then I got one from Black's Law. Now, for those who have heard of Black's Law, Black's Law is what we call the legal definition, or the legal dictionary. So if you were involved in what we call a court case, or anything of that nature, right? You would use Black's Law. Black's Law is where any definitions. If you're questioning or challenging a definition, this is where your judges, your lawyers, all of them are going to get it from. So let's talk about Oxford. Most of you are familiar with Oxford. You've heard of Oxford before, and probably use it throughout grade school as well. But here's what the definition of adultery happens to be in Oxford. It says voluntary. Now notice the term sexual, right? Intercourse between and I'll put quotes around married person and a person who is not their spouse, right? Okay, so notice we've got the introduction of a couple terms there. So notice voluntary sexual intercourse between a married, so term married. Now, from a scripture standpoint, right? If we think about Old Testament, right? And we even just take the story of Jacob, right? Jacob was married to multiple wives, and he had multiple concubines, which was considered to be a marital relationship back in those days. And this is important. I want you to just remember that. Abraham also had, Sarai, or Sarah, who would later become Sarah, was his wife, right? But he also had Hagar. Hagar was, the concubine who bore him sons as well, right? Ishmael. And so, I'm only the reason I'm mentioning this to you is because what we consider to be a marriage here in the Western society versus the ancient view, and even the more broadly world view of what a real marriage is, they're different. So keep that in mind, okay? Here's an example, right? Example says she was committing adultery with a much younger man, right? Notice they use certain pronouns here, right? She, and then with a much younger man. All right, now let's talk about Black's Law Dictionary, okay? Now, mind you, these are the more modern uses or modern definitions for the term. We're going to get into the etymology in just a second, which is the historical use. Where did it come from, okay? Black Law Dictionary defines it as voluntary sexual intercourse of a married person with a person other than their spouse. So notice here, it's not necessarily talking about, very, very closely related, but Again, it's talking about, other than their spouse, right? So very close definitions to each other. Not always the case. Let's dive into the etymology. Let's talk a little bit about the etymology, right? So the one of the original uses of this term adultery as we know it today comes from the Middle English, and it's a vowel tree or ad vowel tree, as you can notice how it's broken out there in terms. Okay, I want to harp on that vowel part of it because when you look at the context of it, we're going to see a little bit later on that this modern use may not be the use of how they were using it back in the biblical days. Okay, now this is from the Anglo-French, which is adultery or adultery, right? Adultery, or the Latin adultorium. Now, at the root of this Anglo-French or Middle English term is adultery, which means to, or is equivalent to defile or to pollute. Okay, I want you to keep that in mind. I'm going to harp on that as we go throughout this, okay? To defile or pollute. Now, here's the first known use in the 15th century, okay? In other words, if we go back to session one, again, shameless plug for session one, the link to session one is actually in the description of this particular episode. So if you look in the description, you'll find a link there directly to session one, okay? But 15th century. So we know that there was a translation or a version of the translation that was translated back in those days. The King James Version. We talked about this on session one. That's an important piece. Go back and watch session one. It's very important that you understand because that King James Version also introduced a lot of other new things to us as well. In session three, and this is a shameless plug for session three, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the use of names, certain names, okay? We're going to dive heavily into it as well. But the King James introduced us also to new names, okay? So just to give you some context of what we're talking about here when we talk about the fact that, the first known use was in the 15th century here for this term adultery, right? Or to defile or to pollute, adulterium, as we see it used there, okay? So let's continue, all right? A little bit more history here. So again, we talk about the Middle English, right? Notice the different adultery, no, alteration. Let's talk a little bit about the alteration here for this one, okay? Formed, which is conformed to the Latin for adulterium. Again, remember we talked about also in session one the fact that a lot of our first translations were translated from the Latin. Latin comes from where? Rome. We're making some connections here. We're gonna make, again, by the time we get to session three is going to lay this out plain and simple for you about exactly what was introduced by Rome. Because there were some entanglements that took place. I'll use that term, entanglement, that took place with the scriptures versus what we read and how we understand it today. Okay. So let's again, adultery, adultery. If you notice there again, the term vow, okay, with the suffix, which is, we know this right from English class, IE or Y, which can be interchangeable, right? That's how we get the term adultery that we have today. Now, notice this was borrowed from the Anglo-French, as we talked about before, adultery, okay, or adultery. And now, again, going back to the Latin adulterium. Now, from adultery, meaning to defile by adultery, right? Notice we talked about that before, the defile or pollute, right? Commit adultery with or to pollute. And then notice the eum added, plus eum at the end, okay? So we're diving a little bit deeper here. I want you to you're connecting some of the dots here. We're connecting some of the dots to the original uses, right? And the historical roots that we're connecting here. So let's dive just a little bit deeper, right? Okay. Adultery, right? Notice there it's used as a noun. Also add vowel tree. Add, right? And the etymology is of adultery. Okay, we got it again. Notice I keep talking about a vow, right? Now, here's the definitions and sense or subsenses for this particular one. So notice the term A here. Violation of, and again, you hear that term marriage, right? Notice we talked a little bit earlier about how the term marriage has been used in the Western society today in modern terms, right? Specifically, Western, but more broadly, even on a global stance, right? Global sense of what that looks like, right? And what it looked like from an old context, right? But violation of marriage, and notice that vows. Okay. So that brings into question, what are your vows, right? Are you introducing a third party into your marriage when you're taking your vows? In today's context, a marriage is between what? Three parties. Three parties. In today's context, if you look at a modern marriage, what do you have to have? You have to have someone that is state commissioned, because at the top of a marriage license, there's a third party in your marriage. The marriage is between two people, okay? Now, it used to be defined as a man or a woman. Now it's just defined as two persons. Kind of going back to what we looked at for the definitions earlier of adultery, right? But it used to be defined as a man and a woman, right? Well, if you go to the original use of the term marriage, it's in Genesis, where it talks about this explains why a man or why a woman leaves her mother and father and marries a man. In other words, you find that in Genesis, where it talks about explanation of marriage. Genesis, I believe it's Genesis 3, 2 or 3 is where you'll find that explanation. Okay, but we're talking about the vow, right? Uh, right now, if you get married and you get a quote unquote marriage license, right? I think a question that comes to mind is, why do you need a license to do something that is originally ordained by your creator? We won't answer that question here. That we'll save that for another day. But I want you to make sure you understand that there's two people that sign on that document, and then there's a third party at the top. State of Arizona, state of Arkansas, at the top of that license, which means it's a three-part. Three parties are involved in modern marriage. Okay. So then the question becomes, well, what are your vows? What are you vowing or committing to doing throughout that relationship, throughout that marriage? Okay. And typically they use some standard words, but that's something to consider. Okay. Save that for a different course. Let's continue. So that is the first context of this. Adultery. Also intercourse between husband and wife. Notice there, right? Again, going back to the root. For recreational purposes. So, that's interesting, because most of you probably didn't consider that if the wife's on birth control, if you're using what they call protection in these days and times as husband and wife, According to this definition, you are having recreational intercourse. That is considered to be adultery. According to what we know here. So I didn't make these words up. I'm just exposing you to what's here. Okay, this is the etymology. This is why getting to the root of a word, the root of understanding is important. Is because you could be using a word in a tense and not even know, or you could be underneath a definition doing a behavior or an act that may fall under that definition and not even know it. So how many of you knew that if you're just, recreational purposes, technically, according to this definition that we're looking at here today, you are falling an adulterous generation. All right, as the scripture talks about it. Okay, let's continue. Also, intention or desire to commit adultery. Okay, so this is if you remember what Jesus said, he said, and I'm only using the term Jesus. Notice and I'll give a quick plug for session 3. We're gonna dive into names, right? So Yeshua. So Yeshua said that I say to you that anyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery. That's one of the New Testament scriptures right there. Anyone who looks at a woman already commits adultery. Well, according to the way the word is in etymology of the use of the word, this falls in line with exactly what we know from that standpoint. Okay. All right. So, to commit adultery, also to live in what we call sin. Now, let's talk about the term sin, right? People talk about sin all the time, right? Maybe not knowing what they're saying or what they're speaking to, but sin is the going against the nature of God. That's when you talk about entering into sin, right? Okay, so to live in sin. Okay, well, what does it mean to live in sin? Okay, what is the very nature of God? Well, the very nature of God says this. It says that if I have a seed, right, from a plant, right, and that if I bury that seed in good soil and I water it, that seed will sprout will die first die, sprout a root that will shoot down, and it will transform into new life after the likeness and image of the plant which it was originally hewed out of. That is the very nature of God. That is to be within what God's order is. Okay? God's order is that he created Adam, and then out of Adam he took Eve and made Eve. And then the two became one flesh. The two were already one flesh beforehand, right? So that is what, when you talk about marriage, most people describe the two becoming one flesh, right? In other words, during intercourse, it takes a man's sperm and a woman egg to make and form new life. That new life is after the likeness and image of the existing lives that came together. This is what we know to be true. Okay. That in its essence and purpose is designed to do what? To be fruitful and multiply, which was one of the first commandments that the Creator gave to who we call Adam and Eve, right? Or who we know as Adam and Eve. Ha'adam, right? And Ahava, I believe it was the Hebrew term. So I say all of that to say that when you think about what is a sin and what is not, sin is going against the very nature of God. That is what sin happens to be, okay? So The nature of God is that a man gives sperm to an egg. That egg is fertilized in a woman through the process, the natural process of intercourse, right? And then the potential or the onslaught of that is that a child comes into play or can be born from that unity, right? From that place of unity, a child can be born. Okay? That's the nature of God. To go against that would be that you would attempt to take a man and another man and get that result. You can't. Or to take a man, male man, right? Right? And a female animal and try to produce that result. That's against the very nature. That's to be in sin. So anything that goes against the very nature of God, that is to live in. That is what it means to live in sin. So B is talking about living in sin, and then C is talking about born or getting in, born or begotten adulteress, a bastard, right? So that's talking about adultery, right? Means we'd have to dive into what that term even means, the bastard term, right? And then falling into or committing adultery, finding in to detect or arrest for adultery, and then holding in to live in sin with. So again, we're getting closer. We're getting closer here. This is helping us to understand the root. Where did this word come from? Okay. Going back to the vow. So let's now dive into the scripture. So now that we've talked a little bit about where this word came from, let's dive into the scripture and talk about some of the context of what we're trying to apply here, okay? So this is Leviticus 20 and 10. This is one of the first places that you're going to find the use or the term adultery in the scriptures, okay? And remember, Leviticus is like the law. This is, after Moses, right after Moses' time, right, Exodus time, where the children are brought out. There are certain commandments that are given to the children of what they can and cannot do that helps them to stay in alignment with not living in sin against God. Okay, and so this is one of those laws. It says here, if a man commits adultery with his neighbor's wife. Now, mind you, remember what we just looked up the definitions and we looked up the etymology. So that means that we've got to analyze, well, which use most appropriately applies in this situation to what they're talking about. So if a man commits adultery with his neighbor's wife, so let me ask, does he have a vow with his neighbor's wife? Both the man and the woman who have committed adultery must be put to death. Okay? So this goes back to covetousness, which means to take something that is not yours and claim it as your own. I want you to think about that, right? We know it's wrong to steal, kill, lie, or destroy. We know who does that. So according to the scriptures, the snake was more slimier than all the creatures that crawled on the earth. It was more sly than any of the beasts of the field and all of that, right? Well, the scripture also confirms that Hasatan or Satan came to rob, kill, and destroy, right? Lie, rob, kill, and destroy. So if that is the case, that there's no agreement between these two, and now all of a sudden another man's taking another man's property at that time, right? I want you to keep in mind, and this is even true even in the Western, from the Western context, right? When the so-called settlers came to the Western society, there were only certain people that were given rights during those times, right? There were only certain people that were given rights during those times. And if you were not a property owning male from Europe, you didn't have any rights. Everything else was considered property. If you had a family, you had children, if you had a wife, that was considered to be your property. Okay, which meant that you had possession or ownership over that. Okay, well, the boundaries were that you didn't mess with another man's property at that time, right? Well, essentially, if you are committing adultery, what we call adultery in this case, right? In other words, you don't have a vow with or an agreement with your neighbor over his property, and you are taking of that property, you've committed a sin. You're going against the very nature of God. God doesn't want us to be taking one from another, especially when without an agreement. I keep going back to that term because you're going to see some of that applied in just a minute. So that's one of the first uses. That's Leviticus 20 and 10. Let's talk about Deuteronomy 5 and 18. Now, that was from the New Living Translation. So notice the one that I gave you back there was from the New Living Translation. This is from the Geneva version, right, that I'm giving you right here, right? This is the Geneva version. Now, Deuteronomy, we know that Deuteronomy, again, took place after, all of the coming out, children coming out of Egypt, out into the wilderness, Joshua and Caleb and all of being sent over into the land, the promised land, them making it to the promised land, them taking 40 years, right? 40 years. Why? Because they kept going against what God was telling them to do. They lacked faith, right? They were what we consider to be an adulterous generation, right? In other words, they were going against what God was telling them to do. And there's a lot of different factors for that, right? We could think about the conditioning that they had while they were in Egypt, right? Egypt was conditioning them into being just slaves and servants. And there's a modern Egypt per se that people live in today to this time, right? When we talk about bringing the scripture forward, right? There's only one people that have been slaves for over 400 years in a foreign land, not their own. And you go look it up, and you'll find. But getting back to the scripture here, right? So I wanted to make sure to set that context. Deuteronomy is where you have Moses getting close towards the end of his life, right? Where he's now setting up the precedences and the things of how they should live, what they should do in the land so that they can live long in the land, right? That now that they've inherited the land, right? That God has given them, or the Creator has given them, right? So Deuteronomy 5 and 18 says this: neither shall thou commit adultery. Now notice how it's spelled here. Remember when we were looking at the etymology and the history, we saw a little bit more about the spelling there, okay? Now, Proverbs 6, again, this book comes from Solomon. So we're going centuries ahead now in time, right? Solomon is the son of David. So we're going, past David times now. And a lot of the Proverbs came from either David or Solomon. But this is Proverbs 6, 32 through 35. It says, but the man who commits adultery is an utter fool, for he destroys himself. Now, that's something to think of, right? Because you're destroying your own things that you committed to, your own vow, right? Not taking the sexual context, which is, what a lot of us will take, that sexual context. And even if you take it in the sexual context, right? You're destroying what you've built or established, which is your own marriage or your own vows, right? If that's the case, depending on what your vows were, right? Depending on what you vowed or committed to doing, your commitment. Are you going against that commitment? So if you commit adultery, that means you're going against that commitment, according to the definition, right? We think about what the definition is and how we have laid out the definition here today. You're going against that, which means you're going against your own self. You committed to this. You're going against your own self, in other words, okay? So that's Proverbs 6, 32, 35. Now we got Psalms. Again, a lot of the Psalms came from David. 106, 39. This is in the New Living Translation. Same thing for the Proverbs. That was in the New Living Translation as well, okay? So again, keep in mind, think about the different, when we talk about session 1, right? We talk about that functional. These are from functional translations, right? The Geneva version is a word-for-word translation. So just to give you the context on that, that's a formal, Okay? So here's what it says. It says, they defile themselves by their evil deeds, and their love of idols was adultery in the Lord's sight. So can we apply what the modern context or the Western context of how we use that term, right? Of how we modern day use the term adultery to this particular scripture. They defile themselves by their evil deeds, and their love of idols was adultery. Their love of idols was adultery. Okay, so in other words, some of the first commandments is that to love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, right? Okay, that was one of the very first commandments that Moses gave, right? Well, a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. That's according to James, the book of James. If you say you love God, you can't also love idols. It's not possible. They can't. Those two things can't exist in the same place, right? So, in this context, the term adultery means to go back on the vow. You vowed that you would love God with all your heart, mind, and spirit, or heart, body, and spirit, that you would love God. Well, to love an idol is to go against that vow or that commitment. In other words, it's sin. To live in sin, it's adultery. So that's what it's talking about here. Not talking about anything from a sexual context whatsoever. So I want you to notice that, okay? All right, here we go. Mark, let's dive into the next one, which is Mark 10 and 11 through 12, okay? And this is, again, in a New Living Translation, right? So, whoever divorces his wife and marries someone else commits adultery against her. So, okay. You divorce your wife, right? Which a writ of divorce was given by Moses because of the grumbling of the people, right? But we have to even analyze that from a standpoint of, do you believe that if you make a commitment or a vow, that there is permissible to break that? That's, again, this is a theological question for those theologians that are out there and scholars in theology. That original vow, does it stand or not? Even if you later get a writ, what we call a writ of divorce, right? That's something to ponder on. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. So that means that the Word exists. So if a man gives his word, what is his what was Scarface's term? All I have is what? My balls and my word. Um, if a man, you can measure a man by the level of commitment that he has to his word. And yes, I understand there are reasons, especially in modern times, right, where people easily enter into the phase of divorce, especially from a Western society standpoint. I think we have some are among some of the highest rates globally, right, of people just calling it quits, going against their vows, right? That means that we're adulterous. We are an adulterous generation, and I am not. This is something that I've also been through myself. So believe me, I am convicting myself as we go into these scriptures. I am also convicted because I have also been through this process. But again, when we think about and analyze the text here, right? Whomsoever divorces his wife and then marries someone else commits adultery against her. In other words, you're going against what that original vow was, and that's true. Okay? That is 100% true. That's what we're talking about here from Mark 10, 11 through 12. Okay? All right, let's continue. So this is John 8, 4 through 5. And this is the good teacher, right? This is some messages that are coming from the good teacher. It says here, teacher, they said to Yeshua, or Jesus as we see it in the context here, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. Okay, so what is the act of adultery? Act of adultery, right? Now, are they talking from a sexual context here? Most likely, right? In other words, she was engaging in, well, from the definition earlier, right? Could be intercourse, right? Or she was defiling or going against, right? A vow that she had had. She was caught in the act of going against that vow, apparently, according to what we have for the context here. Let's talk about Jeremiah. Again, from that previous scripture was from the New Living as well. Jeremiah 23:14 says this, the prophets of Jerusalem, or Jerusalem as we see here, commit adultery and love dishonesty. Are we talking about them having intercourse in this example? Or are we talking about them breaking a vow? And remember, we talked about living in sin earlier as well, right? So that being said, if we're talking about living in sin, well, you can't love dishonesty. Dishonesty is to live in sin. Because God is true in the past, true in the present, and he's true in the future. So whatever is true and righteous, that is of God. Well, if it's not true and righteous, as we see that lying and false prophethood is at an all-time high in these days and times that we live in today. Uh, just turn on your television, your phones, your tablets, anywhere you look, there's going to be prevalence of lies. So if that is the case, then we're living in a time where people are lovers of dishonesty. And so, this scripture becomes true based on that context of, people being lovers of dishonesty. Okay? So that means that is adultery. If you love dishonesty, in other words, you love falsehood, you love that which is fake, right? Then that is adultery. Okay, let's continue. Ezekiel 23:37, it says this: they have committed both adultery and murder, adultery by worshiping idols. Well, idols means those that are fake or false gods, right? Things that you set up beside God, right? So if that is the case, that is going to be adultery because it is entering and engaging in sin or going against a vow or a commitment that was made. Okay, and then this is our final scripture for this particular session, and this will bring us to a conclusion. But Isaiah 57:7-8, and it's the New Living Translation as well. You have committed adultery on every high mountain, worshipped idols, and been unfaithful to me. Now, this is in the context of the Creator speaking to the created, right? And so, when you analyze this, is he talking about in a sexual nature? You committed adultery on every high mountain? In other words, you're just having orgies on high mountains. It's not what it's talking about here. It's talking about the worshiping of idols, of those that which is not of God, right? The worshiping of that's not of the Creator, right? That things that are other than the Creator, and been unfaithful to Him. In other words, you've broken your vow. You went against what His very nature is. You've entered into sin. You're actively living in sin, and that's what it's meaning here. So, again, to wrap up this particular session of the scripture, I wanted to first off say thank you for everyone that tuned in, that listened to this particular session. If you haven't already checked it out, go back and watch session number 1. But this was session 2. Understanding some of the words that we use from a Western context and how we may have been applying those in a wrong or a adulterous context, a way. manner. And how we have used certain words to apply to certain meanings may not be exactly what the writer was intending for us to be able to apply it to in all circumstances and situations. You see that as evidence from the scriptures that we have covered in today's session today. Okay. All right. So again, if this was helpful, if you got anything out of this particular session, drop me a comment down, like, share, and subscribe with someone who needs to hear this. Someone who, has been seeking, but, just doesn't have that clarity that's needed to help them to navigate some of the things that they find in the context of the scripture. Remember, in session 3, we're going to cover, the ever important question of, are names important, right? Is the name Yahweh, is that important? The great I am, is that important? Is it important to keep the context of names? We're going to dive deep into that on session 3, because in order to arrive at a place of being whole, right? When it comes to reading the scriptures, we need to understand where certain things were also taught to us in a incorrect or a wrong manner. By understanding those things, it helps us to be able to understand, well, what was it that we were really supposed to get from the scripture? And that helps us to get closer to the one who created the scriptures and gave us the stories in the first place. So, again, I thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. This has been another episode here. Greatly appreciate you all. I am your brother Nakia. And with that being said, I am out. Peace.